It was nearing midnight when Tom, a seasoned trucker, found himself navigating the quiet streets of a sleepy city, heading toward the highway. He'd been hauling heavy machinery all day and was eager to get to the next rest stop before exhaustion claimed him. The glow of streetlights gave way to darker patches of road as the urban sprawl began to thin out. As he approached a dimly lit intersection, Tom saw a man emerge from the shadows, frantically waving his arms. The figure's clothes were tattered and dusty, his face partially obscured by streaks of dirt. Scratches crisscrossed his forearms, and he looked like he'd been through a rough ordeal. Tom slowed his rig, his instincts warring with his conscience. He knew better than to pick up strangers, but the man looked desperate. Reluctantly, Tom rolled down the window. "What's going on, buddy?" Tom called out. The man's voice was hoarse. "Please, I need a ride. Just to the highway. I'll explain later, just please." Tom hesitated. The man's eyes darted nervously, scanning the area as if he feared someone was watching. Against his better judgment, Tom unlocked the passenger door. "All right, hop in." "But no funny business," Tom said, his voice firm. The man climbed into the cab, clutching a small backpack. As Tom merged onto the highway, he stole glances at his unexpected passenger. The man's clothes were filthy, his hands trembling slightly as he fidgeted with the straps of his bag. "So," Tom began, trying to break the tense silence, "what happened to you?" The man shook his head. "It's better if you don't know." Tom frowned. "Look, I'm doing you a favor. The least you can do is tell me why you're running around like you just escaped a war zone." The man didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his face unreadable. Tom gripped the wheel tighter, uneasy with the man's evasiveness. The highway stretched ahead, its emptiness amplifying the tension in the cab. After several miles of awkward silence, flashing lights appeared in the distance. 2 police cruisers were parked on the side of the road, their blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. As Tom approached, an officer stepped onto the shoulder, waving a flashlight and a clear signal to stop. Tom eased his foot off the accelerator. "Looks like they want to talk to us," he said, glancing at his passenger. The man's reaction was immediate and alarming. He pulled a handgun from his backpack and pointed it at Tom. "Don't stop. Keep driving." Tom's heart pounded. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Just keep driving," the man barked. Tom had no choice. He pressed the gas pedal, the massive truck rumbling past the patrol cars. In his side mirror, he saw the officers scramble into their vehicles, their lights now in pursuit. "You're going to get us both killed," Tom growled, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "They won't shoot at us. Not while you're driving this thing," the man said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos. Tom's mind raced. He was trapped between a man with a gun and the police chasing them. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Why are they after you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted in his seat, keeping the gun trained on Tom. "Just focus on the road." The police sirens grew louder. Tom spotted an upcoming exit and considered his options. If he took the ramp, he might be able to lose the cops on the back roads, but he doubted his passenger would let him stop. "You don't have to do this," Tom tried again. "Whatever you're running from, it's not worth dragging me into it." The man's expression softened for a brief moment, but his grip on the gun remained firm. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this, but I don't have a choice." Tom's frustration boiled over. "You're putting my life on the line. What the hell is so important that you—" Before he could finish, a bullet shattered the passenger side window. The man ducked, and Tom instinctively swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision with the median. "They're shooting at us now," Tom yelled. "Just keep going," the man shouted back. Tom spotted a truck stop ahead and made a split-second decision. He veered off the highway, the police still in pursuit. The truck stop's lot was sparsely populated with parked rigs, their drivers likely asleep. Tom aimed for the farthest corner, hoping to buy himself a few seconds to think. "What are you doing?" the man demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Trying to end this before we both end up dead," Tom snapped. The truck skidded to a halt, and Tom threw the door open. He bolted, his boots pounding against the asphalt as he ran toward a nearby row of parked trucks. Behind him, he heard the man curse and the unmistakable sound of police sirens closing in. Tom ducked behind a trailer, his chest heaving. He peeked around the corner and saw the man standing near the truck, his gun now aimed at the approaching officers. A tense standoff ensued, the police shouting commands for the man to drop his weapon. Suddenly, the man raised his arms and tossed the gun to the ground. The officers moved in, tackling him to the pavement. As they cuffed him, one of the officers approached Tom, who emerged cautiously from his hiding spot. "You okay, sir?" the officer asked. Tom nodded, still catching his breath. "Yeah, just shaken up. Who is that guy?" The officer's expression darkened. He's a wanted thief. Broke into a jewelry store downtown and assaulted a security guard. We've been tracking him all night. Tom felt a wave of relief and anger. He'd been used as an unwitting accomplice in the man's escape attempt. As the officers led the thief away, Tom leaned against his truck, grateful to be alive but vowing to think twice before picking up another hitchhiker. The night's events left him rattled, a grim reminder that even the most routine drives could take a terrifying turn. Tom climbed back into his cab, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the city before dawn. Tom sat in the cab of his truck, the engine idling as he tried to calm his nerves. The adrenaline from the encounter still coursed through his veins, making his hands shake as he gripped the steering wheel. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the polished metal of his side mirrors, painting the scene with an eerie, chaotic glow. A soft knock on the driver's side window startled him. He turned to see one of the officers, a burly man with a trimmed beard and a stern expression, motioning for him to roll down the window. Tom complied, cranking it down manually. "You good, sir?" the officer asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Yeah," Tom replied, though his voice betrayed his unease. "I had no idea he was a criminal. He flagged me down in the city, looked like he needed help. Figured I was doing the right thing." The officer nodded, jotting notes in a small pad. "You're lucky it ended the way it did. That guy's desperate. He's been on the run for weeks and has a history of violence. You're lucky he didn't decide to use you as a bargaining chip." Tom exhaled slowly, the weight of the officer's words sinking in. "I just wanted to get through the night. Never thought I'd end up in the middle of something like this." The officer offered a reassuring pat on the door. "We'll need you to stick around for a bit while we finish processing the scene. After that, you're free to go. You're not in trouble. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Tom nodded, resigned to the delay. As the officer walked away, Tom leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, replaying the events in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the man's desperate eyes or the cold steel of the gun aimed at him. 15 minutes later, another officer approached, a younger man with a more relaxed demeanor. "Hey, Mr. Daniels," he began, reading from a clipboard. "We're going to take a quick statement, and then you'll be on your way." Tom rubbed his eyes, trying to stay composed. "Sure, whatever you need." The officer climbed onto the side step of the truck and leaned into the cab. "You said he flagged you down in the city. Can you tell us exactly where?" Tom recounted the location, the dimly lit intersection, and the man's frantic plea for help. "I thought he might have been mugged or something," Tom explained. "He was covered in dust and scratches. Seemed like he'd been through hell." The officer scribbled notes. "Did he mention anything? Give you any clue about what he'd done?" "No," Tom replied, shaking his head. "Every time I asked, he just clammed up. I figured maybe he was running from someone, but I didn't think it was the cop." The officer nodded. "He's good at playing the victim. That's how he's avoided capture for so long. Pretends he's in trouble, gets people to help him, then either robs them or uses them as a shield." Tom's stomach churned at the thought. "Great. I almost got conned into being his getaway driver." The officer offered a faint smile. "You handled it well. Not everyone does in situations like this." After giving his statement and signing a few documents, Tom was finally cleared to leave. The officers assured him they'd keep in touch if they needed anything else, but they didn't expect to. The thief, they said, had confessed to several crimes during his capture, including his plan to hijack Tom's truck and evade the police. As Tom merged back onto the highway, the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the tires on asphalt helped steady his nerves. The night had taken an unexpected turn, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. The highway stretched ahead, dark and empty, save for the occasional car speeding by. Tom kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. He resolved to be more cautious in the future, no matter how desperate someone appeared. His instincts had screamed at him to keep driving when he first saw the man, and he vowed to trust them next time. Just as Tom began to relax, a faint beeping drew his attention to the dashboard. The CB radio crackled to life, the voice on the other end distorted but urgent. "Hey, trucker, you out there?" Tom frowned and picked up the mic. "Yeah, who's this?" "This is Pete. Just past that truck stop you were at. Saw the cops. Everything okay?" Tom hesitated before responding. "Yeah, had a bit of a situation with a hitchhiker. Cops handled it. I'm fine now." There was a pause on the other end before Pete's voice came through again. "You sure? Because I just saw someone walking on the side of the highway, heading in your direction. Looked kind of rough. Might want to keep an eye out." Tom's blood ran cold. He glanced in his rearview mirror, the darkness behind him stretching for miles. His grip on the wheel tightened as he pushed the truck a little faster, the hum of the engine filling the silence. He told himself it was just a coincidence, The man was in custody, and the cops had assured him there was no one else involved. But as he drove, the nagging feeling in his gut refused to go away. Tom reached over and locked the passenger door, just in case. I had just finished a long haul through the Midwest when my dispatcher sent me a request that seemed out of the ordinary. A woman named Carla needed materials transported to an Airbnb site she managed deep in the forests of Oregon. She explained over the phone that her property included several cabins, and a recent storm had caused significant damage. She needed wood planks, roofing materials, and other supplies to repair the cabins before the summer rush. The job paid well, and I figured a couple of days in the quiet woods might be a nice break from the highways. Carla sounded desperate, almost pleading, and assured me the route was straightforward. "Follow the GPS coordinates. It'll take you right to the main cabin," she said. I loaded up my truck and set out early the next morning. The drive started peacefully enough, winding roads and towering trees replacing the monotony of endless asphalt. But as I got closer to the drop-off point, the GPS began acting strange, rerouting and glitching. I shrugged it off, figuring the dense forests and remote location were to blame. When I arrived at the coordinates, the scene was oddly picturesque yet unsettling. Several cabins sat scattered in a clearing, their wooden structures blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees. Carla, a petite woman in her mid-40 seconds with graying hair tied in a loose bun, greeted me with an enthusiastic wave. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "We've been hit hard by that storm. These materials will make a world of difference." I nodded, unloading the cargo as she pointed to a shed where I could store everything. The cabins themselves looked eerily uniform, as though they had been built from the same blueprint. Their windows stared blankly into the woods, reflecting the sunlight in a way that felt almost accusatory. Carla gave me a brief tour, showing me the damage. "If you're not in a rush, I'd really appreciate it if you could help me move some of the heavier supplies closer to the cabins," she said. "I'll make sure you're compensated for your time." I agreed, figuring it was an easy way to earn a little extra cash. By late afternoon, we had moved most of the materials. Carla seemed relieved and offered to show me one last cabin at the far end of the property. "This one's the oldest," she explained. "It's deeper in the forest and hasn't been rented out in years, but I'm thinking about fixing it up." We loaded a wheelbarrow with supplies and started down a narrow trail. The trees grew denser as we walked, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling silence settled over us. Even the sound of our footsteps seemed muffled. "Does anyone live around here?" I asked, trying to break the tension. Carla shook her head. "Just me. The nearest neighbor is about 10 miles away." We reached the cabin, a decrepit structure that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Its roof sagged, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. Carla set down the wheelbarrow and sighed. "It's worse than I remembered," she muttered. As I unloaded the supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. While Carla inspected the cabin's interior, I wandered around the perimeter. That's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees, partially obscured by the dense foliage. It was too far away to make out any details, but its silhouette was unmistakably human. "Hey, Carla," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is anyone else out here?" She stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the direction I was pointing. "I don't see anything," she said, her tone dismissive. "Probably just your imagination." I wasn't so sure. The figure hadn't moved, and the longer I stared, the more certain I became that it was watching us. Carla waved it off and suggested we head back to the main cabin before it got dark. Reluctantly, I followed her. Carla offered me a room in the main cabin for the night, explaining that it would be safer than driving back in the dark. I accepted, not wanting to navigate the winding forest roads at night. After dinner, she retired to her room, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the trees sway. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since arriving. The image of the figure in the woods lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a faint rustling, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but swaying trees and empty cabins. I was about to head back inside when I heard it again, closer this time. The sound was coming from the direction of the trail leading to the old cabin. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The flashlight's beam wavered as I made my way down the trail. The forest seemed alive, the shadows shifting and twisting as though they were watching me. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I found myself gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I reached the old cabin, it was eerily silent. The door stood ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was damp and musty, and the faint smell of decay lingered. As I swept the flashlight across the room, I froze. Scrawled on the walls in what looked like charcoal were strange symbols and words in a language I couldn't understand. Before I could process what I was seeing, a loud crash came from outside. I spun around, the flashlight's beam darting wildly. I rushed out of the cabin, my pulse pounding in my ears. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the figure I had seen earlier. This time, it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. It was a man, or at least it had been. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He wore tattered clothes, and his movements were jerky, almost unnatural. He took a step toward me, and instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as fast as I could. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of the trees around me. Behind me, I could hear the man's uneven footsteps, faster and closer than seemed possible. I stumbled and nearly fell, catching myself on a tree. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the main cabin. I banged on the door, shouting for Carla. She opened it, her eyes wide with alarm, and I practically fell inside. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there," I managed to say between gasps. "In the woods. He was chasing me." Carla's expression shifted from concern to something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You must be mistaken," she said. "No one else is out here." I stared at her, trying to make sense of her response. "I know what I saw," I insisted. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "There's something I didn't tell you," she admitted. "This land has a history. People have seen things in these woods, things they can't explain." "You knew?" I asked, anger and fear boiling inside me. "I didn't think it would." "Manifest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been quiet for years. I thought it was over." Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside. The windows rattled and the lights flickered. Carla grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." We ran to my truck, the keys already in my hand. As we sped down the gravel road, the headlights illuminated fleeting glimpses of figures darting between the trees. My heart raced as I gripped the wheel, the truck bouncing over the uneven terrain. "Don't stop," Carla said, her voice trembling. "No matter what you see." The road seemed endless, the forest closing in around us. Just when I thought we were in the clear, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, and kept driving until the trees gave way to open fields. When we finally reached the nearest town, Carla thanked me and offered to pay extra for my trouble. I declined, wanting nothing more than to put the experience behind me. I never took another job that involved remote locations. The image of the figure in the woods and the strange symbols in the cabin haunted me for weeks. And though I've tried to rationalize what happened, a part of me knows that some places are better left alone. It was the dead of night, and the lonely stretch of Highway 66 was cloaked in a suffocating darkness that even the brightest of truck headlights could barely penetrate. Mark Hastings had been a trucker for over a decade, and he thought he'd seen it all. Long hauls through desolate stretches of desert, encounters with strange hitchhikers, even the occasional eerie roadside figure. But tonight, something felt different. A weight in the air, a palpable unease that gnawed at his nerves. Mark's destination was a small depot town tucked in the Appalachian foothills. His trailer was loaded with crates of medical supplies, bound for a remote clinic that serviced several isolated communities. The road had been uneventful for hours until he entered a dense forest stretch, the highway twisting like a serpent between towering trees. The branches above intertwined, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight, leaving only his truck's headlights to carve a narrow path through the gloom. A sign appeared ahead, battered and faded. "Next service stop, 40 miles. "Figures," Mark muttered, glancing at his fuel gauge. He had enough to make it, but the needle was precariously close to the red zone. He made a mental note to refuel at the next stop, then leaned forward, his hands tightening on the wheel as the forest seemed to close in around him. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Mark slammed on the brakes, the truck's tires screeching against the asphalt. The figure didn't flinch. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, draped in tattered clothing that hung off his frame like rags. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes. Mark couldn't describe them, but they seemed to pierce through the windshield, locking onto him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Mark rolled down his window cautiously. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The man didn't respond. He simply pointed, a slow and deliberate gesture, toward the side of the road. Mark followed the direction of the man's finger and saw a narrow dirt path veering off into the trees. A smaller, hand-painted sign stood next to it, its words barely legible in the dim light. Help needed. Urgent. Mark's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but years on the road had left him with a soft spot for those in distress, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that ignoring this might weigh on his conscience later. With a reluctant sigh, he eased the truck toward the shoulder and parked. When he turned back, the figure was gone. Mark stepped out, flashlight in hand, scanning the area. The dirt path was narrow, barely wide enough for a compact car, let alone his rig. He contemplated turning back, but curiosity and a sense of duty propelled him forward. He grabbed his jacket, pocketed his cell phone, and started down the path on foot. The forest was eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against Mark's ears. The beam of his flashlight danced across the path, revealing gnarled roots and scattered debris. He hadn't gone far when he saw a small cabin come into view, its windows glowing faintly with an amber light. Mark approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it back and forth. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone here?" There was no response, but the faint sound of a clock ticking reached his ears, accompanied by a low hum, almost like machinery running in the background. Mark stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, its interior dominated by a large wooden table covered in maps, papers, and a scattering of tools. A single lantern sat in the center, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. A framed photo caught his eye. It was of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling broadly. But their eyes. There was something unsettling about them. They were too large, too reflective, almost like the eyes of the man he'd seen on the road. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, his unease deepening. A sudden noise from the back room made him jump. It was faint but distinct, the sound of something scraping against wood. Mark hesitated, then steeled himself and moved toward the noise. The door to the room was closed, but light seeped through the cracks, pulsating faintly as if powered by an unstable source. He opened the door. The room was small and windowless, dominated by a large makeshift machine that looked cobbled together from scrap metal and salvaged parts. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting to a series of glowing canisters filled with a viscous, dark liquid. And in the corner, slumped against the wall, was the man from the road. Except now, his skin was even paler, almost waxy, and his chest barely rose and fell with each labored breath. His eyes flicked to Mark, and his lips moved, but no sound came out. Mark stepped closer, unsure whether to help or run. "Hey buddy, you need a doctor or something? What's going on here?" The man's hand shot out, grabbing Mark's wrist with surprising strength. His mouth opened wider, and this time a raspy whisper escaped. "Leave." Mark tried to pull away, but the man's grip tightened. "You don't understand," the man wheezed. "They're coming." Before Mark could ask who they were, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from outside the cabin. Mark's blood ran cold. He yanked his arm free and turned to face the door, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The door burst open, and a figure loomed in the doorway. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its head too large, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like those of a predator. Mark backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature stepped inside, its head tilting as it studied him. Then, with a sudden bone-chilling screech, it lunged. Mark ducked, the creature's claws swiping through the air where his head had been moments before. He grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it with all his strength, connecting with the creature's side. It let out a guttural snarl, but barely staggered, its glowing eyes locking onto him with renewed fury. "Screw this," Mark muttered, making a break for the door. He sprinted down the dirt path, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The creature's screeches followed him, growing louder as it gave chase. Mark's lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't dare slow down. The truck came into view, its cab a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. Mark practically threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored the accelerator. In the rearview mirror, the creature emerged from the tree line, its long limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Mark's truck barreled down the highway, the trailer swaying as he pushed the vehicle to its limits. The creature kept pace for an impossibly long time before finally vanishing into the darkness. Mark didn't stop driving until he reached the next service station, his hands still trembling as he parked the truck and climbed out. He didn't report the incident, knowing no one would believe him. Instead, he refueled, grabbed a cup of coffee, and continued on his route. The memory of that night burned into his mind. For the rest of his career, Mark avoided that stretch of Highway 66, leaving the forest and its horrors behind. But sometimes, late at night, when the road was empty and the darkness pressed in, he'd glance in the mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at him.